Welcome to 2021, and ironically, I'm going to start this year talking about the same thing I did at the beginning of 2020, and that's the Xbox 360, a console that is now 2 generations old, and yet somehow both still has online features and still has really what I believe to be a degree of relevancy, and I think that is impressive, it's astounding, and I have to wonder how much longer can this go on. And as we move into 2021, we see the Xbox Series X, which if you haven't seen one, in person yet, because they're so hard to come by, hopefully you do this year if you're looking to buy one. As we see that console support the Xbox 360 going forward with just a ton of backwards compatible titles, and games like GTA 4 looking and playing better than ever on there than they did on the original hardware. It gives me the feeling that there's a chance that the Xbox 360 will kind of just live on perpetually forever, and maybe that Microsoft will just kind of support it as is, kind of keep it up there. Now, obviously they supported Windows XP for a long time, but eventually they pulled the plug on that, and the Xbox 360 has even outlived something like Windows XP at this point when you look at their official, end-of-life dates. And while I think the PlayStation 2 will continue to be, and always really will be, the greatest of all time when it comes to a single console library to be able to look back on, and I know people will argue that maybe the PlayStation 1 is it instead. When you look at the volume and the quality of the games, the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2, that's it. Games going forward, I think even as you look back at the Xbox One, you're going to see these games that have a heavy degree of online dependency, and those games ultimately become broken as time goes on. The Xbox 360 is this interesting intersection of games that were both in high definition, had pretty good looking graphics, and also weren't bogged down by microtransactions or an overwhelming amount of online dependency. You got to keep in mind that many Xbox 360 games, up until maybe the ones that were coming out very late in its lifespan, like 2011, 2012, did not require much online connectivity in order to play, the single player experience. And obviously many of these games do have patches. The patches, maybe one day, if the system ever does get taken down, the patches will become unavailable, and that'll be an issue in its own right, but currently it doesn't look like we're trending that way. Then even at that, unlike what you'd see with the Xbox One, many of these Xbox 360 games don't necessarily need the day one patch to play like 100%. Like many of these Xbox One games won't even play without the day one patch, or they're just in a completely unplayable state without them. Not the case with the Xbox 360. It's kind of like the last remnant of, true offline gaming being available. And look, I know the PlayStation 3 still has a degree of online functionality, and ultimately, yes, it came out around the same time period, but the Xbox 360 came out first, and for that reason we have to give it credit for having lasted longer in terms of having those online components up and running. And ultimately, many PS3 games have had individual games go offline, whereas the Xbox 360, you don't really have that problem necessarily. It's more of whether or not you're actually going to find anybody to actually play with in many of these games. And of course, things like Call of Duty, yes, they still do have players online on those older Call of Duty titles, but anything, more obscure than that, which it doesn't take much to become more obscure than the super popular Call of Duty, is probably going to be difficult to find players on when you consider the fact that it's 2021 and this console came out 16 years ago. And at this point, I've collected more or less every Xbox 360 game I'll ever want to play to kind of put in a back catalog, and it was really easy to do that when you consider the fact that many of these games I was spending, $2 or $3 on at most, and ultimately I didn't think the games were ever going to get much cheaper than that, and they're kind of still at that price range. The system itself is relatively cheap as well. I want to say you could probably find one for $50, $60 very easily if you looked on the Facebook Marketplace, and maybe on eBay too, though of course 15 of that's probably going to be tied up in shipping, so you're not going to get quite as good of a deal, but still a very inexpensive console to own and play, even if you decide not to connect it to the internet. And I think that in terms of just that sheer value it provides versus, giving your child, say, a laptop of yours so that they can get it covered in viruses, downloading free vbucks.exe, because they wanted to play Fortnite. Look, Fortnite obviously isn't on the Xbox 360, but there's probably other games that they would enjoy playing, and I can vouch for that, having grown up with this system, and it's just exciting for me to still see it be so relevant today. So my hope for the Xbox 360 in 2021 isn't really actually anything in relation to the console hardware itself. Rather, I would like to see a continued push towards more and more titles being backwards compatible and becoming available on the Xbox Series X, where they're going to have these enhancements, maybe not even necessarily, a graphical enhancement of sorts, but even just making them be available so they can benefit from those faster load times that come with using that SSD, and just the significantly higher processing power the console has in comparison to the Xbox 360's original hardware. And I think that will open more people to going back and actually taking a look at these older titles that otherwise, time has kind of forgotten. So thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.